Good morning, colleagues and friends. Greetings on behalf of Father Holzschneider, his staff, and our association board. It is beyond good to be with you, albeit virtually. From wherever on the planet and from whatever time zone you hail, and in whatever place of the spirit you find yourself, take a breath and enter into these moments of reflection at this vexing yet hope-filled and anticipatory time. As we gather, we call to mind our colleagues who cannot be present, especially Dennis DePero, president of St. Bonaventure University, who needs our prayer as he struggles with serious illness. Welcome into this circle of grace, as Jan Richardson names it, into this hopeful, perhaps exuberantly hopeful time of reflection. Our work, might we imagine and pray this morning, derives energy within this circle of grace, our circle of belonging, of connection, reckoning, and change, of purpose and imagination, the circle of understanding about who and what we are as Catholic institutions, and to what and for whom we are called as their leaders. Our work to lift every voice toward invigorating and propelling forward the God-inspired search for justice, peace, and the common good. Already and always, we are in the presence of God, by whatever name you ascribe to that mysterious and benign presence, pervasive spirit pulling us ever toward the good, divine source upon which our institutions were imagined and built. So a familiar song that encourages our desire to build the city, transform what is into what we know must be, turn the night into day for our students, our colleagues, and for the world. We seek no less than transformed synchrony of soul, mind, and body, clarity of purpose, capacity for success beyond our wildest dreams, and our daily strengthened desire to be ourselves and our institutions a stunning force for good. Both songs today, one performed by students from our sister HBCU institutions as we seek to deepen our resolve around racial justice, are boundless in aspiration and equally compelling in the call to lift every voice and build the city of God. So listen or sing with reverence and purpose. Consider how you and your institution do now and will build the city of God, not in an antiseptic or theoretical way, but concretely within and through the work you do each day.
Awake from your slumber, arise from your sleep. A new day is dawning for all those who weep. The people in darkness have seen a great light. The Lord of our longing has conquered the night.
Let us build the city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing. For the Lord, our light and our love, has turned the night into day.
We are sons of the morning, we are daughters of day. The one who has loved us has brightened our way.
Let us build the city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing.
comfort my people, make gentle your words, proclaim to my city the day of her birth.
Let us fill the city of sorrow, our joy is the answer. Our Lord, our light, our has turned the night into
Whether yours is a large and wealthy university or a small and less resourced one, located in a scantily populated rural town or deeply embedded in a teeming city, building the city of God, setting the world right is your work, our work. As leaders, may our prayer, our pleadings today strengthen our resolve to do this work well and more and better. And so Anne McElhaney Johnson and Father Jerry Olinger will help us with the pleadings. The response to each will be, toward this good end, we lift every voice. Our colleges and universities must be clear, resonant, and committed in the ways in which we own, celebrate, and hold ourselves accountable to the imperatives embedded in the common as well as unique elements of our missions.
Let us reflect often and well on the deep stories that give rise to and sustain our missions today as contemporary Catholic institutions of higher learning.
Toward this good end, we lift every voice. Our colleges and universities engage well with the world, adapt programs and practices to rapidly changing needs, serve as initiators and incubators for principled innovation, for collaborative problem solving, and for value-grounded critical thinking.
May the colleges and universities we lead stand strong and resolute, our staff and faculty courageous, connected, and joined in a common effort to couple our revered traditions with bold spirit and the gospel's call to go teach all nations.
Toward this end, we lift every voice. Our students and those still beyond our reach, and perhaps even awareness, look to us for leadership, for change, for opportunity, for support.
May we see through the intelligent and hopeful eyes of our students and potential students, see their faces and know their names. And then let us extend the reach of Catholic higher education so students can find their way to our doors and ultimately to leadership, exercised through our graduates' successful, fulfilling, and generous lives of service.
Toward this good end, we lift every voice. Our Catholic colleges and universities need leaders, need us, and call us to be thoughtful, courageous, adaptive, principled, kind, and collaborative, to be with and among, both trusted and trustworthy.
May humble prayer, deep listening, sustained reflection, and uncommon courage be the paths we travel toward that kind of leadership.
Toward this good end, we lift every voice. As now we move into the work of the day, we conclude these pleadings with the resolute words of President Biden, "My whole soul is in this." And we all repeat, "My whole soul is in this." And quoting from the inaugural homily of our colleague, Father Kevin O'Brien, "This is your noble commission. This is the divine summons for all of us. As you live out this mission, remember the Lord's promise. The Lord is near. Have no anxiety at all, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. then the peace of God will be with you. And so, as we conclude with joy and renewed determination, we sing what is often called the Black National Anthem, magnificently performed by students from our colleague HBCU institutions. May it inspire and encourage each of us to lift every voice and build the city of God.
Lift every voice and sing. Lift every
And to this, the assembly says, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Sister Andrea, for that incredibly uplifting and moving opening prayer. We are so blessed by your artistic and faith gifts. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I am Julie Sullivan, President of the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. As a member of the ACCU Board of Directors and co-chair of the ACCU 2021 Annual Meeting Task Force, I have the distinct honor to introduce a powerful voice for racial justice, a voice who has a unique ability to quietly convey love for the church, even while speaking with forceful conviction about its failings and needs. Father Bryan Massingale is a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and is currently professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University. His work focuses upon the impact of religious faith as both an instrument of social injustice and a catalyst for social transformation. He is the author of Racial Justice in the Catholic Church and has authored more than 130 articles, book chapters, and book reviews. Father Bryan is a scholar activist, and much of his recent work appears in the National Catholic Reporter, America Magazine, and Commonweal, where he illuminates the raw sin of racial and social injustice, as well as the power of our faith to guide us in eliminating it. Before I turn the mic over to Father Bryan, a reminder for all of you, I encourage you to use the Q&A field to submit your questions during the presentation. I will pose your questions at the conclusion of Father Bryan's talk. Father Bryan, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for that very generous and kind introduction. And good morning to all of my colleagues at the ACCU. It's a joy to be with you. I thank you for this invitation. And even though it's a little strange to be with you via a computer screen, this is our new normal now. So we're kind of used to this. And so we're kind of going with it, but it's a good way that we can gather in this time, in this way, to consider some really pressing challenges that face us as people who work and live and move and breathe in institutions of Catholic higher education. The task that was given to me was to provide insight, challenge, and inspiration, to be provocative and creative in talking about healing the soul of a nation, and to do it all in basically 30 minutes to leave robust time for conversation. So that's going to be a challenge, but I'm going to try my best to honor our time together. To do that, I'm going to share my screen with you, because seeing someone talk, looking at a talking head for 30 minutes isn't fun. I found that out from my students, and I'm sure that we're all students at heart. So healing the soul of a nation, the challenge of racial justice. And just in case you're getting up, and depending if you're on the West Coast, here's the overview for the Zoom weary person, and we're all kind of Zoom weary at this point. I want to talk about the racial divide, and then talk about the reason for the racial divide that we're in, and speaking of the rise of white nationalism. Then I want to talk about healing racial division, and healing is in quotation marks there, because I think we need to understand, what do we mean by healing? Because that word is used a lot, and I want to make sure we have an accurate understanding of what we mean by healing the racial divisions among us. Then I want to speak about what is the responsibility of Catholic higher education in this pressing moment, and then to be honest about some difficult challenges and yet the hope that we bring to this important work. There are many ways of talking about the racial divisions that plague our country. one snapshot, one entry point into this conversation is to look at the experience of our recent presidential election. The divisions in the country were starkly evident during the run-up to the election and its aftermath. Half of the country, a little over half the country, 81 million people greeted the result with a mixture of relief and jubilation. Another part of the country reviewed the results with dismay and even outrage. We are indeed, as Lincoln would say, a house divided. This is the context in which we live and work and minister. But I want to point out that the political division is a racial division. Now, this is something that we know, but we don't always advert to. When we look at the centers of support for the two major candidates, we see a very stark racial divide. We see that supporting the eventual winner, President Biden, 87% of Black voters, 66% of Latinx voters, 63% of Asian voters. The coalition that elected him was heavily composed of persons of color. It's starkly opposite when we look at those who are supporters of the former president. Note the religious divide and the racial divide. 68% of white Christians, 80% of white evangelicals, 73% of white Protestants, and 57% of white Catholics, an increase of 3% over 2016, and 57% of all white voters. What we see in these numbers aren't simple majorities, but super majorities. Supermajority support among white Americans for the former president. His base is what it's always been, white and Christian. We have to remember that his closing arguments for re-election weren't about religious liberty or abortion. We often hear that those are the reasons people gave for backing him. No, his closing arguments and his closing rallies were about illegals and protecting suburbs from violent urban menaces. In other words, his closing arguments were full of open appeals to nativism, racism, and white racial grievance and fear. Given this, the events of January 6th are not only unsurprising, they were indeed inevitable and inexorable. Violence, race-based appeals to violence were constant throughout the past 4 years. Recall the Proud Boys were called to stand by, and he called for Second Amendment solutions. Seeing Confederate flags parading through the US Capitol should not be surprising, as these flags made many an appearance in the former president's rallies. We are indeed, as Lincoln said, a house divided by race. The challenge facing the country then is, are we going to be a country of liberty and justice for all, or only for some? Or as Martin Luther King once put the challenge facing the country in a little known address or little studied address entitled The Three Evils of Society, given in 1967, he noted that he said, if America does not respond creatively to racism, to the challenge to banish racism, then some future historian will have to say that a great civilization perished because it lacked the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all. For all. So we're divided, but the question now becomes why? And we need to get clarity in terms of why, so we can have clarity in terms of how to heal this division and the role of Catholic higher education in that process of healing. To understand the deep divisions that are present in our country, we need to look at the rise of white nationalism, especially as a response to the nation's changing demography. The United States is in the midst of a seismic shift in the composition of its demography. We are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse than at any time in living memory. The last census that we've had, the 2010 census, said that over a third of Americans belong to groups that are not white and not Hispanic. Those are not my terms. Those are the Census Bureau's terms. Don't shoot to me. I'm just reporting the way the government uses these numbers. But we are aware that these groups, persons of color, are historically undercounted by the census. And so the true figure is that the United States is probably closer to 40% of its population being people who are not of European descent. Furthermore, Furthermore, the majority of the nation's children under the age of 12 belong to racial or ethnic minority groups. Moreover, in 2014, the Census Bureau announced that for the first time in history, there were more white American deaths than births. It's projected that by 2043, and the timetable keeps being advanced, whites will no longer be the majority race in America. In short, the country is browning. Another way of putting it is that white Christians are an endangered species. The changing demography signals a changing national identity. We are no longer a white Christian nation, and many white Christians are nervous, upset, anxious, and angry. We see an expression of this in the reaction to the 2012 election when President Obama was reelected. After the election was called, I turned over to Fox News to see how they were greeting this news. And I turned in time to hear Bill O'Reilly, a noted conservative commentator, opine, the demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. The white establishment is now a minority. This anxiety leads some to fear white extinction or even replacement. I apologize for the blunt, vulgar language that's now on your screen, but I think we need to understand how this sentiment is being expressed and the real emotion that's behind it. This is taken from a white supremacist website where the person says, if I see one more Aryan man with a biracial child and his non-Aryan wife or girlfriend, I will physically throw their child over an effing bridge. And then he continues, we will all be extinct if you keep this BS up. Going underneath the outrage and the anger here, what we see being expressed among many segments of our country is a sense of culture shock. Culture shock, that feeling of disorientation or unease. If you've ever traveled abroad or been in a foreign country, at first being abroad or in a foreign country is kind of exciting and things are different and it's wonderful. Except if you stay long enough, you experience a sense of culture shock because they're not doing things the right way, the way we think they ought to be done, the way we do them back home. And what many white Americans are experiencing is a sense of culture shock in their own country, as the major demographic changes underway lead to a sense of an America that is foreign, strange, unwelcome. Culture shock leads to white nationalism. We saw it and we've heard it reflected in the chants that echo through Charlottesville when unhooded white mobs, overwhelmingly male, marched through the streets of an American city with torches declaring, "You will not replace us. You will not replace us." And the president declaring, "I am a nationalist." Not meaning that he simply puts the interests of Americans first, but those who he considers the true Americans, namely those who are white with racial grievance, who fear replacement and the loss of privilege. White nationalism can be understood as the longing for a white utopia, as a country where one is comfortable with being white. My colleague Elizabeth Vasco talks about her experience of being a Peace Corps worker in Kenya and feeling at one point, she called a feeling of white homelessness, of wanting to return to the familiarity of a world defined by whiteness. And she then concluded that implicated in whiteness is a false sense of certainty or confidence about the way the world works and how it should look. This longing for a white utopia that's characteristic of white nationalism received a classic expression, a blunt expression in the events of January 6th. Because one of the ways to understand the insurrection that occurred was that it was a clear declaration that many white Americans would rather live in a white dictatorship than in a multiracial democracy. Indeed, if democracy means sharing political power with people of color, and especially with Black Americans, then it's not worth it. And thousands, scores of thousands marched to make that declaration clear. And public opinion polls have confirmed that while some regretted the violence that occurred, they appreciated the sentiment. White nationalism can be defined as the non-rational, instinctual, the visceral conviction that the country, its public spaces and institutions, and its cultural heritage, that these belong to white people in a way that they do not and should not belong to others. Seen in this way, white nationalism isn't a matter of hate, but of belonging. Who belongs here? Whose country is this? Whose institution is this? Whose college is this? Whose university is this? In a white nationalist sentiment, people of color are present in public spaces by either permission or toleration, that is, in the limited numbers that are needed to satisfy the requirements of decency or diversity, or they're present by fraud or deceit as the inappropriate, illegitimate beneficiaries of affirmative action. And therefore they can be removed by any means necessary when the limits of white comfort is exceeded. And so police are called upon African Americans and others who are engaging in common activities such as being in a Starbucks or waiting in a college dorm or making a phone call in a hotel lobby. White nationalism is bluntly meaning an America for white people, where diversity training is deemed un-American, and even learning about or talking about racism is deemed un-American. Now, most white people do not participate in white nationalism by being overt supporters, but many can play other roles. And I want to especially talk about bystanders. Bystanders are those whose passive agreement or their inaction allows the performance of more overt acts of racial animus and bias. When I talk to my students about this, I say, Imagine your house, your family around the Thanksgiving or Christmas Day meal. And you have that relative that spouts off and tells an off-color joke or makes a racist comment. And what's the reaction that occurs? And they brainstorm, they offer these. Well, that's just the way your aunt or your cousin talks, or really they're good people, or, he's not really that bad, or, some people just can't take a joke, or that's just the way he was raised, or let's just get through the holidays. Let's not make a big deal out of this. Bystanding is essentially a failure to intervene. And Joe Fegan, a prolific scholar, sociologist of American racism, he makes the telling point that the failure to intervene is because of a severe reluctance to make white people uncomfortable and to preserve social relationships with whites. I put that in red because that's going to come back later when we talk about the responsibility of Catholic higher education. The failure to intervene is because of a reluctance to make white people uncomfortable and to preserve social relationships and harmony with whites. But what's important to note is that bystanders perpetuate racism. I've taken to calling this unethical passivity. What do kids learn from adult bystanding? What do our students learn from adult unethical passivity? They learn that it's okay to be racist as long as you have an excuse. It's just how they were raised. Or it's okay to be racist as long as only white people hear it. Or more telling, that it's okay to be racist because other white people will let you get away with it. Or that white approval is more important than doing the right thing. Keep that in mind when we come talking later about the responsibility of Catholic higher education. So white nationalism is basically a matter of who belongs. It's conveyed by open white supremacists, but it's also conveyed by white bystanders who, by their silence, give consent or at least complicity in the nationalist outrage, unease, anger at a changing face of America. Now, given this, how can we talk about healing? How can we talk about healing racial divisions? What's the way forward in healing the American soul? How do we begin to address these deep divisions that are present and are endemic in our American life? The first thing we have to understand, we have to come to a proper understanding of what we mean by healing. We hear a lot of talk today about unity and healing, but we need to understand that there cannot be genuine reconciliation without a commitment to justice. Otherwise, healing becomes just another word for let's move on, let's bury the issue, let's settle for calm instead of deep change. So we need to have a proper understanding of what is healing. Healing isn't a kumbaya moment where we simply say, let's let bygones be bygones. No, authentic healing and authentic reconciliation requires a community to commit itself to the long, slow, painful work of justice and right relationship. I want to illustrate that by putting this in Catholic language. After all, we're talking to a group of Catholic higher educational professionals. And even if you're not Catholic, this is the kind of ethos that you're living in. So let's talk about this in terms of looking at the structure of the rite of penance or the rite of reconciliation. What does it mean to be authentically reconciled when we look at how our own Catholic language and rites unfold? It begins with an examination of conscience. We have a searching, thorough examination of our personal and corporate practices. How have we contributed to the nation's racial divisions by what we've done and by omission, by what we've failed to do? You cannot become whole unless you first are honest about what you've done to contribute to the mess that we're in. A second step then is genuine contrition, genuine sorrow, regret, remorse, lament. We cannot heal unless we've looked at our lives corporately, as institutionally, and then are moved to genuine contrition and sorrow and remorse and lament for our failures and for our acts of commission. Then there's confession. Confession is when we have the public acknowledgement of our responsibility and complicity. The rite of reconciliation has a very powerful way of expressing what confession is all about. I quote here, "We admit that our personal and corporate practices, attitudes, and beliefs have led to an estrangement from God, one another, and from our very selves." Close quote. In other words, in confession, what we are doing is that we're owning how our failures to act or by our corporate practices and attitudes have led us to betray our own mission. We've been false to our own selves. That's then followed by acts of penance, purpose of omission. We take measures to heal the harm that was caused. In the United States Bishop's document, Economic Justice for All, they explicitly say, social harm calls for social relief. Or to quote from the Rite of Penance again, I quote here, "True conversion is completed by amendment of conduct and reparation of injury." Now, back when I was being prepared for first confession, we were taught explicitly that if you stole something, your absolution was contingent upon making restitution, returning what you've stolen. If we harmed someone by lying about them, then reconciliation was contingent upon making right the person's reputation whom we've harmed. In acts of penance and purpose of amendment, we resolve to reform our lives, and we propose concrete measures to help heal the harm that's been caused. And finally, then, there's a proclamation of praise. It's the resolution to make a new beginning and to walk together in light of that new beginning that follows from one's purpose of amendment, one's resolution to change one's life and one's behavior. I think there's a great deal of wisdom here for how we go about healing social wounds and divisions. But the takeaways I want to put forward as we look at this picture of Amy Cooper in Central Park calling the police on Christian Cooper back in May of last year because he had the audacity to ask her to leash her dog because that was what the regulation of the park was. Those are the rules of the park. And yet she warned him, and then she carried through in her threat that she was going to call the police and say that an African-American man was giving her a hard time and endangering her. The takeaways from my examination of the Catholic rite of reconciliation is that healing is possible, but it requires an intentional commitment to engage the division and its causes. It's not a matter of let's move on, let's forgive and forget, or don't make me feel bad. Reconciliation, healing requires sitting in the discomfort of contrition and remorse. It requires honest acceptance of responsibility and a firm commitment to do better. That's what it takes to heal the soul of America. Given then that, what does this have to do with Catholic higher education? What do we have to offer? What contributions do we make toward this task of healing the racial divides that are present among us? I want to offer 4 strategies for going forward, or 4 tasks. The first, I believe that Catholic higher education must engage in a thorough curriculum review and overhaul at each of our institutions. We need to be guided by the fundamental commitment of Catholic social teaching, of the fundamental equal human dignity of human persons created in God's image and likeness. Now that's something that we know, something that each of us will espouse in our mission statement. But if all persons are equal in dignity, then it means that all people can think. All peoples can think. This means that Catholic higher education cannot be responsible to its mission of advancing knowledge if it minimizes or ignores the intellectual contributions of most of humanity. If indeed the voices from Europe or North America dominate in our curricula, then that curricula fosters white nationalism, and Catholic higher education becomes complicit. I once had a student of mine say that he wasn't at all shocked by the lack of African American voices in his educational experience, because as he told me, he said, well, if African Americans had made major contributions to the United States, then surely I would have studied them by now. We can lament his naivete, but it was a naivete grounded in the omissions and the silences of our curricula. This means that we have to foster critical engagement with race across the curriculum and not merely having a required diversity or pluralism course. The question that needs to guide us is, where and how do our students, whom we profess to be future leaders, where and how do they robustly engage US racism and voices of color? If they're not, then we are not equipping them for citizenship, much less leadership. I'm going to go on a limb here and say that if our students are not competent in race relations, they are incompetent for contemporary leadership. And we are failing them not only as institutions of higher education, we're also betraying our own belief in the fundamental dignity of the human person. Second, as institutions of Catholic higher education, we need to look at what do we mean by hiring for mission. And hiring for mission is not only about Catholic identity narrowly understood. If Catholic means universal, and that's something every Catholic learned from little on up, and if race is a life issue, as Pope John Paul II declared, as Pope Benedict declared, and as Pope Francis declared, then the composition of the faculty is an acid test of Catholic identity. The composition of the faculty is an acid test of Catholic identity. We all know, it's often said in educational circles, that the faculty is your curriculum. And if we do not have a diverse faculty, we do not have a diverse curriculum. And we're also failing an acid test of Catholic identity. A third area we need to examine is governance. Here we need to look at who's invited to be members of our board and by what criteria. What is the composition of our board members, and how then do we form our board members to move beyond a fiduciary responsibility and a concern with numbers, but to realize that board members are responsible and accountable for mission. And that means that they are accountable for ensuring a racially just and engaged institution. But our board members can't do this unless they are formed to see this as part and parcel of their responsibility as being board members of a Catholic institution of higher education. Public engagement. Here I want to point out that in many places, the Catholic College is the center of Catholic intellectual life, not only in smaller communities, but even in our larger institutions, in larger urban areas. The question here is, how do we make our resources accessible for those who don't attend our institutions? I'm becoming more and more convinced as a scholar is that I don't want to spend my time reaching only those who can afford to attend my classes at Fordham University. How are we a center for public conversation on pressing social issues? How do we sponsor civic engagement? How do we convene gatherings of civic leaders and activists for honest encounter? How does our institution provide continuing education for church ministers, both lay and ordained? This is often not done by many dioceses, or it's done in a haphazard manner. How do and can our institutions provide continuing education for church ministers and both lay and ordained as they can lead their congregations in this vitally important work of racial healing and justice? And finally, I want to point out that the Catholic College is also a center for truth engagement. We need to speak the truth about the social lies that plague our country. And we must face the fact that all too often in the past 4 years, Catholic institutions of higher education have kept silent about the poisonous lies that have infected our nation's discourse. That, to me, is a failure of our responsibility as institutions of higher learning and education. And finally, our institutions can serve the cause for racial healing by offering opportunities for prayer and lament. I am not one who believes in prayer solves everything, but I do firmly believe that without prayer, we will not make authentic progress in the work for racial justice and healing. We need to gather our community together to pray, to mourn, to lament, because that sorrow and genuine contrition gives us then the energy for the very difficult work that we have to, that's incumbent upon us. I'm going to spend my last few minutes with you dealing with this question, but isn't this hard? Isn't this risky? Is it worth it? I mean, yeah, I can hear some of you out there saying, OMG, does he realize what he's asking of us? And the answer is, yes, I do. I want to approach this by dealing with the question I'm often asked when I give public presentations, and that it goes something like this. How can I talk about this in my institution and not make people uncomfortable? Now let's think about that question. What we're really saying is, how can we talk about this and not make white people uncomfortable? When we talk about upsetting faculty, board members, civic partners, and even our donors, we're talking about white people. How can I do this and not make them uncomfortable? And the bottom line I have to tell you is this, is that if we are unwilling to make white people uncomfortable, then we are never going to be serious about anti-racism and healing racial divisions. We have to have the courage to sit in the discomfort. The greatest weakness of Catholic engagement with race, someone created this meme of me I found on the internet, but it's an accurate quote. The greatest weakness of the church's engagement with racism is that it makes white comfort the limit of that engagement. And that negates the real experience and pain and even terror that many Americans, many Christians, many Catholics experience. I want to put it this way. People invest in authenticity. People invest in authenticity. The question becomes for us, how much is our integrity worth to us? How much is your integrity worth to you? Or as a wiser man, Jesus of Nazareth, once said, "What profit does one show if you gain the whole world and lose yourself in the process?" Authenticity is about being true to our purpose and the values that drive us. We often hear it said that no money, no mission, and that's true. But I also want to say it's equally true is that if you have no mission, then there's no reason to give. There's no reason for support. People invest in authenticity. There's so much more that could be said, and I would love to say more, but I think the most important thing is for us to move to a kind of exchange of views. And so I do this by ending my formal remarks with the concluding words of my book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. So if you haven't read the whole book, this is how it ends. And we meditate on these as we look at this memorial to George Floyd, whose tragic killing led us to this more robust engagement with our perennial weakness of American racism. Social life is made by human beings. The society we live in is the result of human choices and decisions. This means that human beings can change things. When humans break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. Therein lies the hope and the challenge. What is now does not have to be. That's our hope. That's our challenge. I thank you.
Thank you, Father Bryan. That was such a powerful and thought-provoking talk, and we're all thankful and grateful to be able to learn from you and with you. Thank you. I'm beginning to get some questions in the chat, but let me start. What gives you most hope that we're going to make some real progress in this very challenging work right now? You've laid out the importance of the work, the challenges of the work. What gives you some hope that we're going to make some progress, sustainable progress? This has been a sin that we've lived with for centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that hope is one of those interesting words, but I think all too often we confuse hope with optimism. And optimism is that kind of American virtue that things will always get better, that the good guys always win, and sooner rather than later, and the victories are usually low cost. Hope is very different. Hope is a Christian virtue for me as a person of faith, and that means that hope doesn't neglect and it looks at human failure and tragedy and says that these are real. And it realizes you're not always going to win, but you believe that ultimately you're going to win. And so for me, my hope is a transgenerational hope. One of the things that keeps me going in the classroom is that, and I often have this in my mantra as I'm walking to the subway to go to Fordham, at least I did before COVID. I said that by what I teach and how I teach, I believe I'm making a difference. And I think for most of us who are listening, isn't that what got us into this profession? Really, that we believe that by what we teach and how we teach, we believe we make a difference. And what gives me hope is when I get letters, emails from my students who will say, you know, this summer, thank you for the class I took from you on Martin Malcolm Baldwin in the church. Because now I understand what's going on in our society right now. And now I understand, and I'm like, wow. And it was from a student who didn't do all that well, who only got a C+. But something sunk in. That's what gives me hope. The hope is the conviction that, well, one, it's a vocational commitment. I'm doing the work of God, and the work of God cannot ultimately fail. And that work of God is the conviction that by what I teach and how I teach, I'm making a difference. And I may not always see that difference, but I have to believe that, and that's what keeps me going.
I think you've struck at the heart of all of us as educators, and I appreciate that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is who we are.
That's right.
This is. I mean, if we don't believe that, then we need to close our doors. Seriously, I mean, what we're doing makes a difference, and I think, and that's the reason why I'm so passionate that Catholic higher education step up to the challenges I've offered, because that's how we make a difference.
So there's a couple questions kind of about our role as educators, and I'll start there, and then I want to go back to one about the church.
Mm-hmm.
There's one that says, as Catholic educators, must we resolve to speak truthfully to our students and to the wider world about the role of our church in establishing and sustaining racial structures and practice? Does repentance require us to be truthful about past and present? And then I think you've given some comments on that, but let me also add another one. And it's about faculty, of course, have the freedom to set their curricula, and they're especially sensitive when presidents and provosts intrude. So first we want, you know, what is our responsibility as a faculty member to speak truth? And then how do educational leaders ensure that they empower their faculty to do that? I think is the essence of those two questions.
Okay, great questions. The first question is yes, an emphatic yes, that the faith institutions don't have any credibility if they're not honest about their complicity, both past and present. It's no secret that in January 6th, in that insurrection, there were Christian symbols that were also present in that insurrection. People were actually saying prayers. They thought they were doing what they were doing in the name of white nationalism. They were doing in the name of religious faith as well. So we also need to talk about white Christian nationalism. And we need to talk about how religious leaders have been overtly supportive, also how they've been supportive through winks and nods, but also through silence, by not calling out this behavior. And so I think as educators, yes, we have to be absolutely honest about not only the Catholic Church's complicity, but almost every Christian institution and religious body shares some complicity in terms of what's happened in our country or what hasn't happened. In terms of the educator, having the freedom to set their curriculum, that's a two-edged sword. I mean, I'm all for academic freedom, absolutely. However, in the Catholic world, we also believe that rights have responsibilities, and that I have a responsibility as an educator to teach the truth and also to engage with the sin of racism if I'm going to be authentic to my mission of advancing knowledge. I mean, that's what we call it, what we say is our mission. Yes, people get nervous when presidents and provosts, do this, but I think there are two things. One is that the president and provost has to be perceived as not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. In other words, people take their clues from what the president and provost do. And if they see that the president and provost are really behind this, then okay, then we know we got to get on board. The other is incentivizing, to the point that we can, faculty engagement. That sometimes it means that faculty have to relearn their discipline or to learn it in a new way. How do we incentivize that behavior so we can foster that kind of commitment, that kind of pushing in new ways and in new areas. So yes, I understand the fact that we're responsible for academic freedom, but academic freedom needs to be exercised responsibly, and especially when people go beyond the pale, and I've heard all kinds of horror stories, then we need to make it clear that, the institution also has values. We have a need and a right to speak out to foster those values.
Excellent. Thank you. It's very helpful. We have a question that turns a little bit more towards our faith and faith in America. And it says, with Christianity being so tethered to white America, is the browning of America a predictor of the erosion and eventual end of Christianity in America?
It depends upon what we mean by Christianity. No, seriously. I
understand. Yeah.
I say with a joke, but I think that one of the things we need to understand is that if Christianity is going to survive, or if it ought to survive, it needs, and I'm going to use my words here, radical reconstruction. Because the kind of Christianity that would support a race-based insurrection, that kind of Christianity is, to use a religious term, it's idolatrous, it's blasphemous, it's not authentic Christianity. And I wish I could take credit for that insight, but I'm quoting a man named Frederick Douglass, who said that there is a vast difference between the Christianity of Jesus Christ and what he called the Christianity of this land. And so my hope is that as the country browns, that other expressions of the Christian faith can also be heard and can renew Christianity by reconstructing it and basically saying that we need to call out those false understandings of Christianity and create a Christianity that is indeed anti-racist, and I would even say non-patriarchal. How do we create that kind of Christianity? Because I think that kind of Christianity is the only kind of Christianity that's worthy of the name.
And another question really follows up on that theme very well. There's a person indicating, what about using the Catholic frame for challenging racism and other oppression of focusing on we all equally reflect the image of God? We have all been created by God and reflect the image of God, all in all caps. Can you share some thoughts on using this as a frame to get us to this maybe version of Christianity that can be more helpful to us in fighting this sin of racism?
Well, I'm glad that the person raised the question because it gives me a chance to plug a recent essay of mine. It's in Commonweal magazine, and it was about 2 weeks ago in Commonweal, and was called Liberty and Justice for All. And what I did in that was reflect upon not only our civic religion of liberty and justice for all, but how that is completely congruent with the Catholic belief in the fundamental equal human dignity of all human beings. And I love when I teach Catholic social teaching, and I teach this to my students, and I say, yes, all means all. There's no small print, there's no exclusions, and it doesn't matter what your race or your gender or your national origin or your citizenship status or your sexual orientation or your gender identity and expression, all means all. And I think that's absolutely where we need to be. And that ties into this, kind of dueling slogans between all lives matter versus Black lives matter. And I want to say, well, wait, those are not dueling slogans, not at all. Because until and unless Black lives matter, then all lives do not matter. And the reason why we need to say Black lives matter is precisely to get us to that place that our faith and our civic creed call us to, where all means all, with no small print, no exceptions. That fundamental pillar of Catholic social teaching is probably the most radical prophetic belief that we have, that the equal sacred dignity of all created in the image of God. I mean, there's no small print. There are no exclusions. And I give my students 15 extra bonus points if they give me the exact phrases, because I want them to drill in. That's what it really means.
So, and picking up on that as well, we have a question about, has sometimes the pro-life movement of Catholics been complicit with white nationalism? If so, could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, wow. There was a whole section in my original talk that I took out because I didn't know if I'd have time to do this. Yes, I am on record as saying that the Catholic pro-life movement is misnamed because it isn't truly pro-life. It's only anti-abortion. And that is not the teaching of the Catholic Church. Every pope, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, have said, yes, we are committed to the protection of unborn life. But as Pope Francis said, equally sacred are the lives of the poor and the homeless. And indeed, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, Pope Francis took the extraordinary step during his weekly audience of praying for George Floyd and his family by name, and then going on to say that we cannot turn a blind eye to racism or any form of exclusion and claim to be protecting the dignity of all life. So to the extent that American Catholicism has reduced our concern for life to a concern for only one issue, it is not Catholic. It's an American aberration, but it is not Catholic. And yes, I believe that too many Catholic public figures and religious leaders have been complicit in the rise of white nationalism because they would not call it out. They would never criticize the former president by name because they gave him a pass because of his ostensibly, purported pro-life leanings. And that to me is a blasphemous misreading of what our faith is really all about. And it's one of the things I'm very, very passionate about, is trying to get the church to honor what its true teaching is, a robust commitment to life, not only pre-born, but even and most especially after birth.
Well, we're almost out of time, but there's one last question, and I'm going to kind of shorten it a bit. The gist of it is, when you're truthful with your students about all of this, about the failings of the church, how do you then encourage them to look to the church for guidance and moving forward?
Basically, I'm kind of a walking billboard for that. I mean, my students look at me and say, "You're a priest? How can you be a priest and stay in this institution?" And I say, sometimes it's a work in progress. It really is. No, seriously, I think we need to be honest about the fact that our faith is always a work in progress. And I said, I would not be a believer if it weren't for the church. So the church did give me the rudiments of my faith. But now I am an adult and I have a responsibility to contribute to the church to make it even more the institution that it professes to be. As I tell my students, sometimes I see my job as, dragging the church to be more faithful to Jesus. But I say that, it is possible to have a deep disappointment in the church and also a deep love. The two are not mutually exclusive. And that's where by my life, I said, look, I'm wearing this collar now for over 35 years. And I speak the way I do, calling out my church, but I do so out of love.
And you're a wonderful role model and inspiration to all of us to do that. Thank you very much, Father. We have come to the end of our session, but I want to share with our audience that our conversation does not end here. We will have a short break before the concurrent sessions begin at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So please check your schedules for the details so you can choose which of the 3 concurrent sessions you'd like to attend. One does continue to focus on race in a Catholic context, but all 3 promise to be very informative and helpful to our work in Catholic higher education. And now, as we close, I want to thank Father Bryan again for his time, for his wisdom, for really, I think, helping to guide and inspire, uplift, motivate us all to passionately embrace both that hope and challenge that what is now does not have to be. There is hope, there is challenge. It is, and therein lies the hope and the challenge. And we as leaders in Catholic universities and colleges passionately embrace that hope and that challenge and look forward to working together with one another in doing so. So thank you, Father Bryan. This has been just marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you.
And everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.